In this video, we're going to look at primary elections in America. The American political system is a two-party dominant system. While there are independent candidates, there are minor parties, it is dominated by two parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. At election time, voters often end up with a choice between those two options. But how do those candidates get there? That's what we're going to investigate. When it comes to nominating candidates or choosing party leaders, there are different methods that political parties can use. Some parties around the world might use a membership vote, where the members of the party select local candidates or nominate leaders. Ideally, what would happen here is that you would pay a certain amount of money each year, an annual membership fee, and in return you get the right to vote in nomination meetings to help choose candidates. Others use delegate voting, where they might send representatives from constituencies to nominate candidates or select leaders. There's also the role for legislators. People that are in the legislature might have a role in nominating candidates or choosing leaders. For example, in the United Kingdom, the Conservative Party has narrowed a list and nominated a list of candidates and then sent that list to the membership for vote. So there's different ways that candidates can be selected to run for office. Or you could have a primary election, and that's the system they use in America. What exactly is a primary election? Well, it is an open election. Rather than restricting participation to paid members of political parties, it's open to anyone who's a registered voter. The key distinction here is that it is a preliminary election. It's an election that happens before the general election. And so we will have primary elections in America that happen usually in the spring or summer before a general election. That allows voters to vote in a primary to select their preferred candidate. Of course, around the United States, there are different rules and thresholds. Some have closed primaries where you have to be registered as a Democrat or registered as a Republican to vote in that respective primary. Others have open primaries where independent voters can participate. There's also different rules around winning thresholds and runoff elections. These can look very different from state to state, but we're just going to focus on the things they have in common. So here's how a typical primary might look. In May, June, for example, before an election, in the election year, each party will open itself up to candidates that want to participate in the primary election. So the blue party, the Democrats might retract some candidates, the red party will, and then on primary election day, voters will cast their votes for the candidate they prefer. The winning candidate in the primary goes on to the general election. So the winning candidate from the blue party and red party will face each other in the general election. So it's kind of like a preliminary election within the party, if you want to think of it that way. These can look very different. For example, some districts, congressional districts, are very Democratic leaning. They have a lot of, in this case, blue party voters. And so they will attract a lot more competition, a lot more interested candidates, because there's a higher likelihood that they're going to win. And the red party might not have as much luck. We could flip that around. In red-leaning districts, there might be a lot of interest from Republicans and not so much for on the Democratic side. The assumption being that because it is a leaning district, odds are that that candidate will win. It's going to be a tougher fight for them to get out of the primary than it will be to win the general election. They'll have an easier time in the general election. Also, competitive districts that could swing either way. Different election cycles. Sometimes there's only 17 or upwards of 30 competitive districts, but they'll attract interest from both parties. And that means a lot of money, a lot of fundraising, a lot of TV ads, a lot of digital media ads to try and win that primary. Now, it's not uncommon for parties to try and influence the result of the other party's primary. You will find at times the Republican Party or Republican political action committees might try and intervene to influence the results of the Democratic primary. The same is also true the opposite way. The Democrats will sometimes try and participate through spending to influence the results in the red party. So here's how an example of that might look. Let's say we've got a few red party candidates. Blue candidate is pretty much acclaimed. They know they're who's going to stand for them. But when they're looking at the general election, they think about which red party candidate they might want to face. One of them could be really popular and really strong. In that case, what would happen is they might have some fundraising directed at an unpopular candidate to try and boost them up. They want to face the weaker candidate in the general election, so they will do whatever they can to boost that unpopular candidate, or alternatively, they might run attack ads at the leading candidate to try and diminish their popularity, again, in hopes of facing a weaker candidate in the primary. So that's one way they might try and intervene to influence the results of an opposing party's primary. In the 2026 midterm election cycle, interesting thing happened in Nebraska. We had a somewhat red-leaning district, but a down year for the Republicans, at least in terms of public opinion polling. Looked like it could be a competitive seat, but being a Democrat in Nebraska isn't really that popular. You're probably not likely to win statewide. Well, in the Senate primary, there was also an independent candidate that was very popular and had demonstrated some electoral success in the past, or at least viability as a candidate. So the independent candidate kind of complicated the math a bit, because they were very popular. They'd probably take some votes from the Republicans, probably more votes from the Democratic voters. And when you poll them in a three-party race, the red party has an advantage because some of those more independent swing voters would be less likely to vote for a Democratic candidate, but they might line up behind the independent. So in a three-way race, the Republican Party looked pretty good. Democrats wondered if there was a way they could try and coordinate something to make the math a little more favorable. Maybe if they didn't run a candidate and instead urged their supporters to support the independent candidate, then they might stand a better chance of defeating the Republicans. Now, the Republicans did have a crowded primary at the time. So what was going to happen? Well, the Democratic candidate said they might drop out of the race in order to pave the way for a two-candidate race between the Republicans and the independent candidate. With that, the Republicans realized the math changed. So what they did was got an ex-Republican to join the Democratic primary with the promise of staying in the general election. The idea was being that voters might be more inclined to support that candidate, the primary. At least that was the hope, because then the Republicans could ensure that they got a three-way race instead of just a two-way race between the Republicans and the independent candidate. Well, what happened? Turns out that the candidate who promised to drop out did win that primary. So that sort of paper candidate, the stand-in candidate, didn't win. The red party, the Republicans nominated their candidate. So it looked to be a three-way race, but then, as promised, the Democratic candidate promised to withdraw from the race and urged Democratic voters to support the independent candidate in the general election. So that's another way that parties can try and influence or manipulate the results, is by supporting or encouraging people to run in a primary in order to ensure that they could split the vote in a general election. So that's a lot. Just to recap, primary elections are preliminary elections. They're an election before a general election where party supporters can vote in an open election to choose the candidate they want to see in the general election. Open to all registered voters. If you're registered to vote in a congressional district, then you can vote in a primary. And of course, parties will try and intervene and influence the results of their opponents' primaries to get a more favorable matchup in the general election.